Okay, so picture this. It's December 1897, up in the Wyoming high country. The settlement of Stillwater Creek is facing a problem they've created themselves, a grain silo that's supposed to carry them through winter, but there's less in there than there should be. Someone's been taking it. Not much, but in a frontier winter, when you're calculating calories per day and rationing down to ounces, even a few pounds matters. And because frontier settlements run on suspicion the way they run on flour, someone needs to hang for it. The finger points at Hazel Voss. Now, Hazel is 16. She's been 16 for 6 months. Her father died 2 winters before, pneumonia that filled his lungs and prevented him from seeing spring. That leaves Hazel and her mother in a 2-room cabin on the settlement's edge, and her mother spends most of her time in a particular kind of silence that's all about grief. Hazel works. That's her job. She cleans. She cooks. At the settlement's main house, she helps in the kitchen during harvest preparation. She's useful, which is why nobody expected her to be accused of anything serious. But Yvette Mora, that's the Reverend's daughter, beautiful in that way that makes other girls resent her on instinct. Yvette started saying she saw Hazel near the grain silo. Late at night. She didn't see her taking anything. She just saw her near it. That's enough. And my granddad used to say that in a small settlement, one person's story becomes truth if nobody contradicts it loud enough. Hazel's mother didn't contradict it. Anna Ostrom, who was old and kind, tried to. Nobody listened to an old woman. So, on a December morning, when the temperature hadn't risen above 10 degrees Fahrenheit for a week, the settlement called what they call a reckoning. Reverend Aldous Creek, a man who wears a formal black suit on the frontier and carries a leather ledger like it's scripture, stood in the square between the main buildings, and he read Hazel's crime. Not stealing the grain. The suspicion of stealing the grain. In a settlement, those two things are the same. The punishment was exile. Immediate. Right now. Take whatever you can carry and get out. I still can't wrap my head around this part, even knowing how the story ends. They didn't accuse her during a trial, because trials require proof. They just exiled her. And in 1897, in December, in Wyoming, exile in the winter is effectively an execution. It's just slower. Hazel left that afternoon. She had a wool coat, her father's. It fit her shoulders loosely. She had a tin cup, a knife, a blanket, and maybe 3 pounds of hardtack that Anna Ostrom slipped her when nobody was looking. That's roughly 900 calories if I'm doing the math correctly. In a winter where you're burning 2,500 calories a day just staying warm, that's about 4 hours of survival. She walked north, away from the settlement, away from any direction where they might think to look, and she walked until the light started failing, which happens at about 3:30 in the afternoon in December up there. And that's when she found the cave. It wasn't hidden exactly, it was just unthinking. It was a limestone cave at the mouth of a side canyon, probably 30 feet deep, with a natural spring inside that meant water. The entrance faced south, which meant it caught whatever weak winter sun there was. The walls were rough stone, pale grey-white limestone with bands of darker minerals running through it, and it was empty. Nobody was using it. Nobody had been using it for maybe 100 years, since the area's native people had moved or died or been forced out. Hazel sat down on the cave floor that first night and did something important. She made a calculation. My granddad used to say that every action in a survival situation starts with numbers. She had maybe 900 calories of hardtack. Her body was burning approximately 2,500 calories per day. Actually more, because she was small and her body was young and in crisis, so it was probably closer to 2,200 calories in a rested state, but that number goes up when you're moving, working, shivering. By those numbers, she had less than 1 day of food. She had water. She had shelter that was fundamentally useless without heat, because a limestone cave at 10 degrees Fahrenheit is just a slower way to freeze to death. So, She did something that most 16-year-old girls exiled into the Wyoming winter don't do. She decided she was going to stay alive, and she started breaking her prison into a home. That first phase was about heat. She found wood, deadfall in the canyon, aspen and pine that had been down long enough to be brittle but not so long that it was rotted into mulch. She gathered what she could carry, which was maybe 30 pounds of firewood. That sounds like a lot. It's not. In a cave, with minimal insulation, 30 pounds of wood burns in about 4 hours. She collected another load, and another. By the time the light was gone, she had maybe 150 pounds of wood stacked inside the cave entrance. That buys her roughly 36 hours of continuous fire before she's down to nothing. She built the fire on the cave floor, using rocks arranged in a rough circle to contain it. She had no mechanism to draft the smoke out, so the cave filled with smoke for the first several hours. That's a problem she'd solve later. That first night, she sat in the smoke and shivered and tried not to think about what happens when the fire goes out. Here's where it gets insane, in a way. The next morning, when the sun came up, weak but present, she started digging. Now, I don't think Hazel had any formal knowledge of shelter design. I don't think she'd read any books about thermodynamics or heat retention or how underground spaces maintain temperature differently than exposed ones. But she understood something. She understood that a cave is already mostly insulated, and that the smallest space requires the least heat to warm, and that if she could reduce the size of the area she needed to heat, she could survive longer. So she dug out a section of the cave floor, maybe 6 feet wide and 8 feet long and 3 feet deep. It took her 3 days of work, using a broken pick she found in the canyon, something left from old mining operations probably, and a flat stone that she could use like a shovel. The work was punishing. After the first day, her palms were bleeding. After the second day, the bleeding had stopped, which meant the skin underneath had died and hardened into calluses. The smell of earth being dug, it's not a metaphor, it's a real sensory thing. A particular damp mineral smell that gets into your clothes and your hair and stays there. That filled the cave and mixed with the smoke from her fire. When the depression was done, she packed down the floor with the flat of the pick, stamping it firm. Then she did something clever. She lined the bottom with straw that she'd gathered from an abandoned homestead deeper in the canyon. Then she put pine branches on top of the straw, the ones with needles still attached, because pine needles have oils that don't decompose quickly, and they insulate, and they smell like something other than earth and smoke. By the end of the first week, she had a sleeping depression. It sounds crude when you describe it, but she could curl up in that 6x8 space, and the stone walls on 3 sides meant that her body heat didn't dissipate into a vast, cold cave. It stayed close to her. The temperature difference between sleeping in that depression and sleeping exposed on the cave floor was probably 5 to 8 degrees. In December, in Wyoming, that difference is the difference between surviving the night and not. The second phase was about water. The spring in the cave, it wasn't a rushing spring. It was a seepage, a slow weeping of water from a crack in the upper stone, maybe a gallon per day, which is oddly perfect. In a 1897 frontier winter, you need about a gallon of water per day per person if you're doing any cooking or cleaning. And another liter? Just a drink. A gallon seeping in is precisely adequate. But she needed somewhere to collect it and store it. The water was cold, close to freezing, and it was carrying minerals and possibly bacteria from the limestone. She couldn't just drink straight from the seepage. She found an old wooden bucket in the canyon. It was split, barely holding water, but the wooden slats were salvageable. She also found what looked like a clay pot, or the broken pieces of one, that had been discarded years before. She set up a collection system. The seepage dripped into a flat stone depression, which overflowed into the bucket, which she could dip into for drinking water. And here's the thing about that water. It tasted like stone. It had a particular mineral quality, not quite pleasant, but not bad. It was cold enough that it hurt to drink it quickly. It was cleaner than the water at the settlement, which came from a well that the whole community used and which had a way of becoming slightly contaminated as winter wore on. Hazel's cave water was fresh and mineral-rich, and it kept her alive. The third phase was about food, and this is where the story becomes something other than a survival tale. This is where it becomes about human persistence in a particular direction, where a 16-year-old girl doesn't just survive, she builds something. She had eaten the hardtack in the first few days. It was gone by January 4th. That meant she had 0 calories being input. Her body was burning 2,200 calories per day, just existing. Do the math. She had 4 days before her body started consuming itself seriously. 8 days before she was in genuine metabolic crisis. So she ate what the canyon provided. This sounds romantic. It wasn't. She found frozen berries on plants that still had fruit clinging to branches, maybe 200 calories, maybe less. She found bark that she could strip and boil into a sort of thin soup, not much nutrition, but some. She caught small animals, prairie voles, mice, a rabbit that was slow from cold. She killed them, used her knife, was efficient about it, didn't waste the resource, and ate them raw or roasted on sticks held over her fire. A single rabbit is maybe 600 calories if you eat the whole thing, including the organs. It wasn't enough. By mid-January, she was losing weight, visibly. Her collarbones became pronounced. Her hands looked skeletal. And that's when she started the growing system. Now, think about this for a second. She's in a cave in January in Wyoming. There's barely any light, maybe 6 hours of weak gray daylight. The temperature inside the cave is hovering around 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, which is above freezing, but barely. And she decides she's going to grow vegetables. It's almost insane. Except it wasn't, because she understood something about plants and growing cycles that most people don't. She understood that seeds have dormancy, and that dormancy can be triggered by exposure to cold and moisture, and that seeds that have gone through that process will sprout when the conditions become favorable. She found vegetable seeds. This is actually not as hard as it sounds. Frontier settlements have seed stores, reserved vegetables and seeds that are kept for next year's planting. When Hazel was doing work at the settlement's main house, she would have had access to those stores. She'd taken maybe 10 packets, lettuce, carrots, turnips, beans, squash. She'd hidden them in a crevice in the canyon, just in case she needed them. She did. The first thing she did was build growing beds. She used the wood from an abandoned homestead and pounded it into rough rectangular frames, 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, about 8 inches deep. She made 3 of them. Then she did something harder. She dug out soil. She had to dig deep into the earth in the canyon, where the soil remained warmer, avoiding the frozen surface layers. She carried approximately 200 pounds of earth back to the cave in baskets and buckets. 200 pounds. In January, that's the weight of an adult man, carried piece by piece through a snow-covered canyon. She filled the beds with that earth. Then she did something crucial. She mixed in the remains of her own biological waste, composted, let me be clinical here, and ash from her fire. Nitrogen, carbon, minerals. She was building soil from nothing. The beds were positioned to catch whatever light entered the cave. But that wasn't enough. The cave interior would have been dim, barely bright enough to read in, certainly not bright enough for plants to photosynthesize efficiently. So she improvised a mirror system. She found pieces of reflective material, broken mirror glass, probably from an abandoned cabin, carefully preserved, and she positioned them to direct the weak winter sunlight deeper into the cave and onto the growing beds. It was crude. It probably only increased the effective light by maybe 30%, but 30% more light is the difference between plants that slowly die and plants that survive. She planted the seeds. The lettuce sprouted first, within about 10 days of planting. The first time she saw those tiny green leaves pushing up through the dark soil, she cried. I want to be clear about this. This is not a movie moment. This is a 16-year-old girl who hasn't eaten adequately in weeks, who is surviving on rabbits and bark and her own willpower, and she sees her first successful vegetable crop, and she cries because it means she's not going to die. The carrots took longer. Carrots need consistent soil moisture and soil temperature, which is hard to maintain in a cave. She had to water them by hand, using water from the spring, and she had to keep them at a temperature that would allow germination, which, in a cave in January, was actually easier than it sounds, because the cave stayed around 45 degrees, which is close to ideal for carrot seed germination. They sprouted after 3 weeks. The turnips were similar. The beans needed warmer soil temperature, so she positioned those beds closer to the fire. By early February, she had 4 growing beds with visible growth. The lettuce was ready to eat. That first salad, she harvested maybe 2 cups of tender lettuce leaves, tasted like life continuing. Lettuce has almost no calories, but it has nutrients. It has taste. It has the idea that food could come from more than just what the canyon would surrender to her knife. But here's the thing that most survival stories miss. She didn't grow vegetables solely for immediate consumption. She cultivated them strategically to produce more crops. Every time a lettuce plant reached mature size, she harvested it, but she left the roots. The roots would sprout new leaves. She was creating a renewable system. One seed packet of lettuce could provide multiple harvests over weeks if managed correctly. She was thinking in cycles, not treating each moment as a separate survival crisis. And here's where the animals came in. She found the goat in early February. It was in the canyon, thin from the winter, half-starved. It would have died in another week, probably. She coaxed it back to the cave with vegetable scraps, the first real use of her growing system, feeding the goat the lettuce that wasn't quite hearty enough or the carrot tops that she didn't need. The goat was small, a Spanish breed, maybe 40 pounds. It had curved horns and intelligent eyes. The goat's body heat changed everything. A living animal in a cave produces warmth. A 40-pound goat generates roughly 200 additional BTUs per hour just from metabolic respiration in a 400-square-foot cave space. That's meaningful. The temperature next to the goat was noticeably higher than the temperature 5 feet away, but the goat also provided other things. Milk. If she could figure out how to milk it, she'd watched the settlement women milk their goats, so she had the idea, even if she'd never actually done it herself. Manure, which was gold for her growing beds. Fiber, eventually. Though a goat's hair wasn't as useful as sheep's wool. That's in company. Psychological survival, which is not a small thing. She built a pen for the goat in a section of the cave. Not a large area, maybe 8 by 10 feet, with wooden rail sides and a floor of straw and earth. The goat would stand in there at night, and the warmth from its body radiating into the space was enough to reduce the temperature drop during the darkest hours. Then, in mid-February, she acquired the chickens. There was an abandoned homestead maybe 2 miles from her cave. She'd discovered it while foraging. The homestead had a basic chicken coop, deteriorated but standing. Inside, impossibly, were 2 chickens. They weren't wild. They still had that look of domestic birds, though they were thin, and one had a torn wing. Hazel captured them. It took hours, but she was patient and carried them back to the cave. 2 chickens weigh maybe 3 pounds each. Each one produces an egg every day and a half or so if they're fed properly, and if they're in a light cycle, that makes sense. The cave didn't have a natural light cycle that would trigger laying, but if she could provide food and keep them warm, they could survive. And 1 egg is maybe 70 calories. That's nothing in normal times. In January, starvation conditions, 1 egg is the difference between stability and decline. She built a roost for them, a wooden shelf carved into the cave wall, about 7 feet up, where predators couldn't reach them. The shelf was lined with straw. She positioned it near the fire, where the heat rose and warmed the space around them. She fed them on vegetable scraps from her growing beds and crushed eggshells to provide the calcium for new egg production. By the end of February, she had a micro-ecosystem. 1 cave, 1 teenage girl, 1 goat producing milk and manure, 2 chickens producing eggs and additional manure, 3 growing beds producing lettuce, carrots and turnips, a fire system that burned wood and produced heat and ash, a water system that collected the spring seepage. It wasn't a large system, By modern standards, it would probably produce maybe 1,200 calories per day. Eggs, milk, greens, and whatever animals she could still catch. But it was a closed loop. It was sustainable. It was working. The physical change to her body was visible. By late February, the prominent ribs started to soften. Her hands weren't skeletal anymore. She had enough energy to work 8 hours a day, maintaining the fire, caring for the animals, tending the growing beds, processing food. She was alive in a way that was more than simple survival. And here is where the moral complexity starts. In early March, a messenger came from the settlement. Well, a messenger-type person. It was Douglas Weatherby, the settlement's lead farmer. He was a huge man, scarred face, one eye milky white from an old injury. He'd come into the canyon alone, which was risky, which meant he was serious. He sat down on a rock outside her cave entrance, and he told her that the settlement was in serious trouble. The grain stores had lasted longer than expected because people were rationing harder than they thought they could. But there'd been a miscalculation about the length of the winter. Wyoming winters don't follow a calendar. They follow a climate pattern that sometimes runs long. They had food for maybe 30 more days. There were 47 people in the settlement. 47 people times 2,000 calories per day equals 94,000 calories needed to get to spring. They didn't have 94,000 calories. They were going to be short by maybe 20,000 calories, which doesn't sound like much until you realize it means somebody doesn't eat for 10 days, or everybody eats less for 20 days, or some combination of slow starvation. And the settlement had been talking. Someone, Hazel never learned who, but she had theories, had started saying that Hazel probably wasn't guilty, that Yvette Mora might have been lying or mistaken, or had some grudge that was more personal than the truth allowed, that maybe the real theft had been something else entirely, or nothing, or an accident. The logic of frontier justice is that you execute quickly before anyone has time to second guess. So the doubt was already eating away at the certainty. So they sent Douglas Weatherby to ask if she would help. That was the moment that Hazel could have said no. Douglas Weatherby didn't beg. He was a practical man. He said, "We exiled you unfairly. I didn't speak against it at the time. And I should have. I'm here to ask if you would consider providing food to the settlement. We can't pay you. We can't offer you anything, except the possibility that we'll believe you if you ever want to come back." Here's where the story gets human, in a way that's more complicated than the survival narrative. Hazel was alive. The cave was working. The animals were thriving. She had built something, and now she was being asked to dismantle it for the people who had exiled her in the first place. She asked Douglas to sit down, and she made him tea, hot water, with herbs from her hanging garden, with a little honey that she'd found in the canyon. And she told him she needed to think about it. What she was actually doing was calculating. And here's the calculation. She was producing approximately 40 eggs per month. That's 2,800 calories per month from eggs. She was producing maybe 15 pounds of leafy greens per month, depending on the lettuce varieties. That's maybe 1,500 calories per month. The goat was producing milk, maybe a half-gallon per week, which is 960 calories per week, or about 4,000 calories per month. So, rough total, 8,300 calories per month. The settlement needed 20,000 calories to get through winter. She had 3 weeks of winter left until the snow melted enough that people could survive on foraged food, so they needed 14,285 calories from her. If she gave them that much, she would have 8,300 minus 14,285 equals negative 5,985 calories per month. She would starve quickly, but she could also give them the goat. A 40-pound goat, killed and processed and distributed, is approximately 8,000 calories. If she killed the goat and gave it to the settlement, they'd have 14,285 plus 8,000 equals 22,285 calories, which was more than they needed. She'd be left with eggs and greens and maybe the rabbits she could catch. She could survive on 6,300 calories per month if she was careful. She could live on eggs, greens, and hunted animals. She would be hungry. She would be less secure than she was now, but she could do it. But if she killed the goat, she'd lose the milk production. She'd lose the manure for her growing beds. She'd lose the body heat. She'd lose something that felt like companionship in a cave that was otherwise entirely solitary. And here's what made it harder. She remembered specific words from her exile. Reverend Creek had said, "You are a thief and a burden on this community. You will remove yourself." Yvette Mora had said, loud enough for others to hear, "I'm glad she's gone. She was always strange." Anna Ostrom had said quietly, "I don't believe this is true." But Anna's voice stood alone. Hazel sat in her cave at night, with the goat's warmth pressing against her in the darkness, and she thought about what it meant to help the people who had done this to her. She thought about not doing it, about saying no, about watching the settlement face starvation, about being right, about being proven right, about the injustice that had been done to her. That's what justice looks like sometimes. The people who hurt you face consequences. But she also thought about the fact that the settlement had children, that not everyone in that settlement was Yvette Mora or Reverend Creek, that Douglas Weatherby had come alone into the canyon, which was a risk, which meant he was taking responsibility for what the settlement had done. That Anna Ostrom had tried to defend her, had been overruled, and didn't deserve to starve. She made the decision on a night when the goat's ribs felt particularly solid against her, as she lay in her sleeping depression, and she thought about her father, who had died because the settlement's doctor didn't have the supplies to save him. In the morning, she told Douglas yes, but not the whole goat, and not without conditions. She said, "I will provide eggs, milk, and greens. I will continue to do that through the spring, while the settlement adjusts. I will not give you the goat because the goat is necessary for the system to continue, but in 2 weeks, there will be new lambs born in the canyon. I've seen the ewes there, and I know where they're sheltering. I'll help you capture them and bring them back. You'll have meat and milk and eventual wool. But you have to agree to something." Douglas said. "What?" "You have to tell people the truth. You have to tell them that I didn't steal the grain. You have to say it publicly in the settlement until everyone knows it, and you have to allow me to come back if I want to. Not now. I'm not coming back now, but you can't prevent me from coming back." Douglas said yes to all of that. The next day, Hazel packed a basket with eggs and milk and the most robust lettuce she could harvest without killing the plants, and she walked with Douglas back toward the settlement. She didn't enter the settlement itself. She met Douglas and 3 other men, including Reverend Creek's personal assistant, who was less of a monster than the Reverend, at the settlement's northern edge, where the canyon opened up to the farmland. She handed over the basket. She said, "This will need to be eaten within 2 days, except the lettuce, which will last longer if it stays cool. The eggs and milk need to be rationed carefully. Don't cook away the nutritional value by overheating. A 1/4 gallon of milk and 2 eggs per person per day, mixed with whatever grains you have left, will stretch to 14 more days. That should be enough." And then she left. She walked back to her cave, alone, and she didn't look back. What happened in the settlement was complicated. Douglas Weatherby and Anna Ostrom immediately made it clear that Hazel was innocent, that Reverend Creek had acted on insufficient evidence, that Yvette Mora had lied or been mistaken. Reverend Creek's response was to insist that Hazel was still dangerous, still suspicious, still fundamentally wrong, which made him look increasingly unreasonable, especially as Hazel's food kept arriving and kept people from starving. Over the next 3 weeks, eggs and milk and greens came from the cave, delivered by Douglas or by Anna Ostrom's grandson or by other settlement people who were beginning to see Hazel not as a criminal, but as a resource, a valuable, intelligent resource, a girl who had survived through wit and knowledge and would have been an asset to the settlement if they hadn't exiled her like a fool. On the 3rd delivery, Yvette Mora came along. She brought a letter. Hazel doesn't remember the exact words. It was something about how Yvette had been young and influenced by her father and the pressure of the settlement, and she was sorry for lying, but she didn't face any real consequences for the lie, which is how frontier justice actually worked. Hazel read it and didn't respond. She took Yvette's empty basket and put new food in it and sent her back. She wasn't going to forgive Yvette Mora. Not for a perfunctory letter. Maybe not ever. But she also didn't need to. And then came the day when Reverend Creek himself came to the canyon. He came alone, which surprised everyone. He came to the cave entrance, and he called for Hazel to come out. She did. She stood in the cave mouth, and she looked at a man in a formal black suit standing in snow, and she waited. He said, "The settlement sent me to ask if you would return. We need your knowledge. We're building a new agricultural system based on what you've done here. We need someone to oversee it." Hazel said, "Did Yvette send you?" And no, Anna Ostrom sent me. She said you were the only person they could trust to build something fair. Hazel stepped out of the cave, and she walked Douglas and Reverend Creek through the entire system. Every growing bed, every aspect of the animal care, every detail of how the fire worked and how water was collected and how temperature was maintained. It took 3 hours. Reverend Creek asked questions. Some of them were intelligent, most of them were basic, but at least he was asking. At the end, Hazel said, "I'm not coming back yet. I'm staying here through the spring and the summer. I'm going to expand this system, grow more animals, establish larger beds. In the fall, when the weather turns again, I'll come back. I'll teach whoever wants to learn. But I'm not doing it because I forgive you. I'm doing it because there are people in that settlement who didn't try to execute me with supposition and fear." She came back the next fall, and that's when the real work began. Because once she was in the settlement, once she had space and resources and the community's labor force, she expanded the system that she'd created in the cave. She worked with Douglas Weatherby to identify good sites for underground storage, caves, root cellars, any space that maintained stable temperature. She worked with Douglas and with other farmers to establish expanded growing beds using the cave's model: careful soil preparation, seed selection, controlled conditions. By the spring of 1898, 6 months after she'd returned, the settlement had sufficient stored food that they would never face the starvation calculus again. By the following fall, 3 other frontier settlements in the region had sent people to observe her methods. By 1900, Hazel, now 18 years old, recognized as a legitimate agricultural authority despite her age, had helped establish a network of underground growing systems across the region. She never married. She never moved far from that original cave, which she maintained as a model and resource center. Frontier life was hard, and marriage would have meant giving up her authority, and she'd already given up more than enough to other people's expectations. Anna Ostrom lived to be 92. When she died, Hazel held a memorial service in the settlement because Anna had been the one person who chose belief over fear. Reverend Creek lived to be 76, and he spent his final years insisting that he'd always believed in Hazel, that the exile had been a terrible misunderstanding, that he'd been the one who sent Douglas to find her. He revised history in small ways, the way people do when they need to feel better about themselves. Nobody believed him, but nobody contradicted him either. Yvette Mora moved away. She married a railway administrator and had a life in Denver, which is probably what she wanted all along. Douglas Weatherby became Hazel's closest collaborator and eventually her closest friend. He never tried to marry her. He understood that what they had was something other than romance, something that mattered more than possession. It was partnership and mutual respect that forms between people who solve difficult problems together. And the cave became historical. By the 1920s, it was a tourist site. People came to see the cave where Hazel Voss had survived the winter of '97, where she'd built her underground garden system, where she'd taught the frontier how to eat in the cold. The walls are still blackened from her fire. The stone, where she carved marks tracking the days, still shows 67 marks, the days between her exile and when Douglas first came to find her. But here's what I think my granddad would have appreciated about this story. It's about a girl who survives through systematic thinking and careful planning. It's about someone who looked at a problem, starvation in a winter given the resources available, and worked backward from the solution rather than hoping for rescue. She understood that heat comes from fire or from biological processes. She understood that food can be grown under controlled conditions. She understood that animals provide both heat and renewable food resources. She understood that interconnected systems are more sustainable than isolated individual solutions. She understood at 16 something that a lot of older people never learned, that the best solutions are the ones that make you less dependent on other people's mercy. And when the settlement that had exiled her came back and asked for help, she had the power to say no. She also had the knowledge to say yes, in a way that cost her something but didn't destroy her. That's the actual shape of dignity in a frontier story. Not forgiveness. She didn't forgive the settlement, and she shouldn't have. But practical humanity, given the choice. This is Caleb Nordstrom, reminding you to subscribe for more stories about people who built something from nothing and survived by thinking in systems instead of moments.